The air in the interrogation room was thick with fear, the walls silent witnesses to horrors carefully documented yet barely whispered. In Nazi Germany, torture became more than a tool. It was an industry, a systematic instrument of power designed to crush bodies, minds, and dignity. But it wasn't merely about inflicting pain. It was about control, humiliation, and transforming punishment into spectacle, turning human suffering into a precise, bureaucratic art. The world often remembers the gas chambers, the marches, the concentration camps, but beneath these horrors lay another form of cruelty: the deliberate, calculated torture of individuals deemed enemies of the Reich. Unlike medieval punishment or arbitrary executions, this was modern, methodical, and chillingly efficient. By the 1930s, the Nazis had already reinvented torture. What had once been a blunt instrument in history, chains, whips, stocks, became mechanized, structured, and ideologically charged. The Gestapo, the SS, and the intelligence arms of the regime collaborated to design systems that could extract information, instill fear, and maintain strict social and political obedience. The goal was not just confession, it was submission, the surrender of will. One of the first things to understand is that Nazi torture was never random. It was rationalized as necessary, scientific, even legal. Manuals were written, rooms were designed to maximize psychological torment, and every step of the process was logged. Torture was not only an act of brutality, it was a process. Prisoners were studied like specimens, and their breaking points mapped with astonishing coldness. It began with the selection process. Jews, political dissidents, homosexuals, Romani people, and anyone who resisted Nazi authority were categorized. Each category came with its own set of interrogation protocols. A political prisoner might face relentless questioning for hours, deprived of sleep and basic needs. A member of the resistance might be subjected to sensory deprivation or threats against family members. The Nazis understood human psychology and used it ruthlessly. The methods themselves combined physical and psychological torment. Sleep deprivation became an instrument of control. Prisoners were woken repeatedly, forced to remain standing for hours, or left in rooms with flickering lights and constant noise. Sensory overload and isolation, techniques that psychologists today might use in controlled experiments, were weaponized. Prisoners were often moved through a series of cells designed to disorient, break routine, and instill helplessness. One notorious method was the Gestapo cell, a small, windowless room that became an arena for both fear and confusion. These cells were not just spaces, they were instruments. Prisoners could hear distant screams, the echoes of interrogations, the scraping of chairs, the quiet whispers of those already broken. The mind began to unravel long before the body did. Physical torture was applied strategically. It was never haphazard, but part of a calculated plan. Beatings were administered to leave marks without immediately killing the victim. The goal was endurance under pain, forcing prisoners to comply, confess, or betray others. Some methods mimicked the medieval, like stress positions, but were adapted for modern efficiency. Interrogators were trained to observe responses, measure thresholds, and adjust techniques to maximize compliance. Yet, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Nazi torture was its integration with ideology. The process was not just about control, it was about dehumanization. Torture reinforced the narrative of racial and political superiority, the idea that certain lives were expendable. Victims were labeled as subhuman, and their suffering was normalized within the machinery of the state. Publicity was carefully managed to conceal atrocities, but internally, torture became a rite of power, an invisible backbone of obedience. The psychological manipulation was equally sophisticated. Prisoners were often subjected to mock executions, forced to watch the suffering of others, or coerced into betraying their friends and families. The Nazis understood that breaking a person's will could be achieved without leaving visible scars. Fear, uncertainty, and hopelessness became tools as effective as whips or clubs. Medical science, horrifyingly, played a role as well. Some doctors, under the guise of experimentation, observed reactions to extreme conditions: cold, starvation, and pain. They meticulously recorded findings, transforming human suffering into academic data. These experiments were often justified as furthering scientific knowledge or national interest. The combination of ideology, pseudoscience, and methodical cruelty created a new paradigm of torture that was uniquely modern. The camps themselves became laboratories of terror. Interrogation rooms, disciplinary barracks, and transfer centers were all components of an industrial system designed to crush resistance and instill absolute fear. Every element, from lighting and architecture to the timing of meals and movements, was calibrated for psychological impact. Escape was virtually impossible, and even survival came with constant reminders of vulnerability and exposure. One of the lesser-known aspects was the targeting of gender. Women were subjected to forms of torture that exploited societal expectations and roles. Humiliation, sexualized degradation, and enforced submission were tools designed to strip away identity and autonomy. The objective was clear: total domination over both body and spirit. Political prisoners, meanwhile, faced endless cycles of questioning, threats, and betrayal. The Nazis perfected the use of forced confession, combining inducement with fear. Even when no tangible evidence existed, prisoners were manipulated into admitting guilt, ensuring the machinery of law and punishment appeared legitimate. In this way, torture became inseparable from the legal and bureaucratic apparatus of the state. Resistance networks, particularly those operating within Germany, were systematically dismantled through these methods. Interrogators were trained to identify weak points, to exploit loyalty and camaraderie, and to turn comrades against one another. The psychological impact extended beyond the individual. Families, communities, and social networks were destabilized by fear and suspicion. Yet, amidst this darkness, there were acts of quiet resistance. Prisoners developed codes, routines, and strategies to survive. Humor, subtle gestures, and mental exercises became ways to preserve dignity. These small acts did not stop the machinery of torture, but they demonstrated the human capacity to endure, even under unimaginable pressure. The reinvention of torture in Nazi Germany was not only a physical phenomenon but also a cultural and technological one. Bureaucracy, psychology, and ideology converged to create methods of control far more efficient than in previous eras. Torture became a science, a ritual, and a tool for societal engineering. Its effects rippled through communities and history, shaping the modern understanding of state-sponsored cruelty. What set Nazi torture apart was its meticulous documentation. Records were kept, manuals written, and techniques standardized. Interrogators trained new personnel with drills and observation. Each case added to the cumulative knowledge of how to break humans systematically. In this sense, cruelty became an institution, embedded into the very structure of governance. The legacy of this era is haunting. Survivors recounted the terrifying precision with which they were monitored, interrogated, and dehumanized. The lessons extend beyond history. The fusion of ideology, bureaucracy, and psychology can create systems of oppression far more insidious than isolated acts of violence. Through these methods, the Nazis established not just fear but control over the minds and bodies of millions. Torture became a language, spoken in whispers, screams, and silence. It shaped the landscape of modern oppression, leaving a blueprint for authoritarian regimes long after the fall of the Third Reich. In examining this period, it becomes clear that torture is never merely an instrument of punishment. It is a tool of power, identity, and ideology, capable of reshaping individuals and societies. Nazi Germany, with its methodical and industrialized cruelty, represents the dark intersection of technology, law, and human depravity. Even decades later, historians and psychologists study these methods not to glorify them, but to understand the depths of human manipulation, the mechanisms of control, and the resilience of those who endured. The stories of the tortured remain lessons in vigilance, a reminder that systems can be engineered to dominate, and that humanity must resist their machinery. The rooms are empty now, the walls silent, yet the echoes persist. The meticulous records, the diaries of survivors, and the testimonies of liberators allow us to reconstruct the reality of systematic cruelty. Through understanding, remembrance, and education, we confront a chapter of history that transformed torture from a primitive act into a chillingly modern institution. And yet, even in this darkness, the human spirit persisted. Small acts of courage, subtle defiance, and mutual support helped some survive. These stories, often hidden within the broader history of atrocity, reveal a glimmer of resilience, a testament to the endurance of the human mind even in the face of industrialized cruelty. The machinery of terror extended beyond interrogation rooms and camps. Streets, workplaces, and homes became extensions of fear, where the mere presence of the Gestapo or SS could fracture lives. Torture was not always visible. The threat alone was enough to bend society to the Reich's will. Rumors of disappearances, whispered stories of endless beatings, and carefully propagated narratives of punishment created a climate where suspicion and paranoia thrived. One particularly insidious aspect was the use of informants. Ordinary citizens were recruited, coerced, or incentivized to report on neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. This extended the reach of torture into communities, as fear of betrayal amplified psychological stress. People never knew who could be the next interrogator in disguise, who could carry the report that would seal a neighbor's fate. Torture, in this sense, became a social weapon. The targeting of women reveals another layer of cruelty. Female prisoners were subjected to methods that combined humiliation with terror. While physical violence was present, much of the suffering was psychological. Enforced nudity, threats of sexual assault, isolation, and forced compliance with degrading tasks. These methods exploited societal norms about gender, manipulating shame and modesty to inflict maximum psychological damage. In these cases, torture was as much about erasing identity as it was about extracting information. The infamous Ravensbrück concentration camp, a site designed specifically for women, illustrates the terrifying intersection of gender and cruelty. Here, political prisoners, Jews, Romani women, and asocial women endured forced labor, medical experimentation, and psychological torment. Torture was woven into the fabric of daily life. Prisoners were punished publicly to intimidate others, forced to witness the suffering of fellow inmates, and subjected to constant surveillance. Every act reinforced the power of the captors and the helplessness of the captive. Medical experiments represented a particularly chilling dimension. Doctors, wearing the guise of science, subjected prisoners to extreme conditions: cold, starvation, infection, and chemical exposure. Women were forced into procedures that exploited reproductive biology, often under the pretext of studying fertility or disease. These experiments were meticulously recorded, blending science with sadism, creating data sets from human suffering. They were bureaucratized, normalized, and horrifyingly systematic. The psychological torment of Nazi torture cannot be overstated. Prisoners were subjected to endless cycles of fear, mock executions, threats against loved ones, and manipulation of hope and despair. The Gestapo mastered the art of anticipation, where the unknown became the most powerful weapon. Prisoners could never relax, never trust, never predict the next moment of terror. The mind, as much as the body, became a battlefield. Resistance within this system was rare but remarkable. Prisoners developed secret codes, memorized schedules, and used small gestures to communicate and maintain a sense of humanity. In some cases, they wrote clandestine letters, kept hidden diaries, or memorized songs as a form of mental preservation. These acts of defiance, subtle as they were, represented the resilience of the human spirit under conditions engineered to destroy it. The bureaucracy of torture also played a crucial role. Every act, every beating, every interrogation was logged. Records were used to monitor performance, plan future interrogations, and maintain a sense of order and accountability among perpetrators. Torture became a documented, auditable process, an innovation in cruelty. Manuals guided interrogators in methods and psychological manipulation, and experienced officers trained recruits in the efficient administration of suffering. The integration of ideology made Nazi torture uniquely insidious. Victims were often seen as enemies not merely of the state, but of race, religion, and society itself. Torture became a moralized act in the twisted worldview of the regime, Breaking a prisoner was a service to the nation, a way to purify society, a form of righteous domination. This ideological framing allowed perpetrators to rationalize their actions and society to acquiesce, creating a culture where cruelty became both accepted and expected. The intersection of law and torture further legitimized these horrors. Courts and tribunals often relied on confessions extracted under duress, and the legal system was manipulated to provide cover for acts that were clearly immoral. Torture was not a lapse in justice, it was the law itself, embedded into the very institutions designed to uphold order. The process created a feedback loop where cruelty, legality, and ideology reinforced one another. Camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen became epicenters for refining methods of torture. Techniques that combined sleep deprivation, starvation, physical abuse, and psychological terror were continuously tested and perfected. Prisoners' responses were observed, documented, and used to adjust protocols. The goal was efficiency, maximum control with minimal expenditure of resources. Torture became industrialized. A particularly horrifying aspect was the targeting of children and adolescents. Youths considered politically unreliable or racially undesirable were subjected to indoctrination, humiliation, and coercive labor. Psychological torture shaped them, bending loyalty, instilling fear, and destroying innocence. Their suffering was intended to perpetuate the ideology of the regime across generations. Sexualized forms of torture were pervasive, yet they were framed as punishment and control rather than gratification. Women, especially, were humiliated through forced labor, invasive examinations, and public degradation. The aim was total submission, eroding self-respect and social identity. In this way, gender became a lever of oppression, amplifying the impact of terror. Prisoners were forced into a constant state of hyper-awareness. Every glance, every sound, every movement could trigger punishment. This created an environment where survival depended on anticipating cruelty and suppressing any display of autonomy. Torture extended beyond physical pain, creating a continuous psychological prison. The reinvention of torture in Nazi Germany illustrates how cruelty adapts to modern systems. Combining ideology, bureaucracy, and science, it became a method of total control. It was efficient, targeted, and relentless, leaving few survivors who were untouched by trauma. The legacy of these methods continues to inform studies of authoritarianism, psychological manipulation, and state-sponsored violence. The survivors' stories emphasize endurance and humanity. Despite unimaginable pressure, they found ways to resist, maintain personal rituals, and preserve bonds of trust. Their courage reminds us that even in systems engineered for dehumanization, human resilience persists. These accounts, while harrowing, are essential to understanding the full scope of Nazi cruelty. Historians and psychologists continue to analyze these methods, not to glorify them, but to understand how systems of oppression function. Nazi torture was more than violence. It was a calculated, adaptive strategy that blended ideology, law, and human psychology. Its lessons are vital for recognizing the mechanisms of control and resisting them in any era. Even after liberation, the psychological scars persisted. Survivors struggled with trust, trauma, and the memory of betrayal. The meticulous nature of Nazi torture meant that it affected every layer of identity: physical, emotional, and moral. Recovery was a long, arduous process, underscoring the depth of systemic cruelty. The world remembers the Holocaust, the camps, and the mass executions, but understanding the methods of torture reveals another dimension of human suffering under totalitarian regimes. It shows how violence can be industrialized, how ideology can justify cruelty, and how institutions can be weaponized to dominate human bodies and minds. In the end, the story of Nazi torture is not only about horror, it is about the structures of power, the manipulation of fear, and the resilience of those who endured. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about obedience, dehumanization, and the human capacity for both cruelty and survival. By studying these methods, we gain insight into how regimes can bend morality, law, and psychology to oppressive ends. We are reminded that vigilance, empathy, and the defense of human dignity are essential to preventing history from repeating itself. The lessons of Nazi Germany are a cautionary tale. Torture is never merely physical. It is psychological, societal, and institutional. It can become a science, an ideology, and a weapon all at once. And the survivors, who endured unimaginable suffering, bear witness to both the darkness of human cruelty and the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. As the world continues to study these atrocities, one truth remains clear. Understanding the mechanics of oppression is crucial. Only through knowledge can we ensure that the machinery of terror, the calculated cruelty, and the systematic dehumanization exemplified by Nazi torture are never repeated. Even as decades pass, the echoes of those rooms, cells, and camps remain. They speak to the enduring need for accountability, for empathy, and for the recognition that power, when unchecked, can be weaponized with terrifying efficiency. The story of Nazi torture is a stark reminder of the fragility of justice and the enduring importance of defending humanity against systems designed to crush it. And in the quiet reflection of history, we honor the survivors. Their courage, endurance, and memory remind us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure, and that remembering these lessons is essential to safeguarding the future.